I gave my family everything, and the first clue that something was wrong came from a question my own son thought he had already asked years ago. It happened on Thanksgiving, the kind of cold Iowa afternoon when the wind rattles the kitchen windows and the smell of turkey fills every room. I had spent 2 days preparing dinner, just like I always did. At 72, I moved a little slower than I used to, but traditions mattered to me. My son Daniel arrived just after 3 o'clock with his wife, Vanessa. They carried expensive bottles of wine and wore the relaxed confidence of people who never worried about bills. I hugged them both and told myself how fortunate I was to have family nearby. We sat around my dining table, the same oak table my late husband Robert had built with his own hands more than 30 years ago. For a while, everything felt normal. Daniel talked about work. Vanessa talked about a vacation they were planning. I listened, smiled, and passed the mashed potatoes. Then, just as I was serving pumpkin pie, Daniel looked up and asked a question that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Mom, did that retirement account ever work out the way you wanted?" I stopped moving. The pie server remained suspended in my hand. "What retirement account?" I asked. Daniel laughed softly at first, as if I were joking. "The one Dad helped set up before he passed away." My heart gave a strange little flutter. "Daniel, I don't know what you're talking about." His smile faded. Across the table, Vanessa lowered her eyes. It was only for a second, but I noticed. "The account," Daniel said slowly. "The one that was supposed to help with your expenses. You've been using it, haven't you?" I stared at him. For the past 4 years, I had been stretching every dollar. I drove a 15-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard. I compared grocery prices down to the penny. More than once, I postponed replacing things around the house because I thought I couldn't afford it. If there was a retirement account, I had never seen a cent from it. "No," I said quietly. "I haven't." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else in the room. Daniel looked confused. Vanessa reached for her water glass. Her hand was steady, but she drank too quickly. "That's strange," Daniel said. "I thought everything had been taken care of." I wanted to ask more questions right then. I wanted answers. But years of experience had taught me something important. People reveal more when they think you know less. So I smiled. I cut another slice of pie. I asked if anyone wanted whipped cream. The conversation slowly restarted, but something had changed. Every glance, every pause, every unfinished sentence suddenly felt significant. That night, after they left, I stood alone in my kitchen. The dishes were clean. The leftovers were packed away. Outside, the yard was dark and silent beneath the November sky. I opened an old photograph of Robert on my phone and looked at his familiar smile. Then I thought about Daniel's question. A retirement account. Money I had never received. A plan I had never heard about. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of unease settle into my chest. Someone had hidden something from me. And deep down, I knew my family never expected me to notice. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel asking about that retirement account as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. By 5 o'clock the next morning, I was already sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for 4 years, ever since Robert passed away. In the beginning, I thought I would eventually get used to living alone. People told me time would help. They said I would find a new routine. In some ways, they were right. I learned how to manage the lawn service. I learned how to fix small things around the house. I learned how to eat dinner without hearing another voice across the table. But there was a difference between surviving and feeling secure. After Robert died, I became careful with money. Very careful. I stopped buying little luxuries. The monthly salon appointments disappeared. Restaurant dinners became rare. I clipped coupons from the local newspaper and planned meals around grocery store sales. When my refrigerator finally stopped. Working 2 years ago, I spent 3 weeks comparing prices before purchasing the least expensive replacement I could find. I told myself that was simply what responsible people did. Retirement was supposed to be about stability. Instead, every unexpected expense felt like a threat. During winter, I kept the thermostat lower than I wanted because heating costs continued to rise. I wore sweaters indoors and wrapped myself in blankets while watching television. More than once, friends suggested taking vacations together. Weekend trips to Missouri, a river cruise on the Mississippi, a visit to the mountains in Colorado. I always declined. I would smile and say it was not the right time. The truth was simpler. I did not think I could afford it. Yet Daniel never seemed concerned. Looking back, That should have stood out to me. Whenever I mentioned expenses, he would casually tell me not to worry so much. Whenever I talked about budgeting, he would change the subject. At the time, I assumed he simply hated discussing finances. Now I was not so sure. As the morning sunlight slowly filled the kitchen, memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments, strange moments, the kind of things that seem meaningless until they are placed beside a larger picture. About 3 years ago, I remembered mentioning that my savings account was earning almost no interest. Daniel had exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa before telling me everything would work out. At Christmas the following year, I mentioned that I might sell a few pieces of jewelry to create a financial cushion. Vanessa had immediately discouraged the idea. She insisted I was doing better financially than I thought. At the time, I found the comment comforting. Now it sounded different in my memory. Around 8 o'clock, I opened a drawer beside the refrigerator and pulled out an old notebook. It was where I kept important dates, account information, and household expenses. I started turning pages. Utility bills, insurance payments, property taxes, medical expenses. Everything was there. Every dollar carefully tracked. But there was no retirement account. No deposits. No unexplained income. Nothing. I sat back in my chair and stared through the window at the empty backyard. The oak tree Robert planted when Daniel was 10 years old still stood near the fence line. Strong, steady, unchanged. I wished answers came that easily. Instead, I was left with questions. More questions than I had ever had before. And for the first time since losing my husband, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt doubt. Not about money. Not about paperwork. About people. About trust. About how much of my life had happened right in front of me while I was looking somewhere else. I spent the next few days paying closer attention than I had in years. Not because I wanted to accuse anyone of anything. I simply wanted to understand. The older I got, the more I learned that the truth rarely arrived all at once. It revealed itself in pieces. A forgotten comment. A strange reaction. A detail that never quite fit. On Tuesday morning, I drove to the grocery store and ran into an old neighbor named Carol. We stood near the produce section talking about the weather and rising food prices. At one point she smiled and said, "I always admire how independent you are. Most people your age would have already moved into one of those luxury retirement communities with the resources you have." I laughed politely, assuming she was mistaken. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I said. Carol looked surprised. "No, I mean your family is doing so well. Daniel told everyone years ago that your financial future was completely secured." The comment stayed with me all day. Daniel had apparently been telling people I was financially comfortable. Yet he had never once asked why I drove an aging car. He had never questioned why I repaired old appliances instead of replacing them. He had never offered help when I worried aloud about rising expenses. The contradiction bothered me. That evening, I sat in my living room with a legal pad and began writing down every unusual memory I could recall. At first, the page remained mostly blank. Then another memory surfaced. About 2 years earlier, a bank envelope had arrived while Vanessa was visiting. She had brought in the mail and casually mentioned that she would place everything on the kitchen counter. Later that evening, I remembered searching for a particular statement and never finding it. At the time, I assumed I had misplaced it. Now I was not so certain. Another memory followed. Then another. Several times over the years, important mail had seemed to disappear. Tax documents, financial notices, information packets. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm. Just enough to be inconvenient. Looking at the growing list, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Iowa weather outside. The following afternoon, I opened an old filing cabinet in my home office. Robert had always been organized. Every document had a place. Every folder had a label. I spent nearly 3 hours reviewing records. Most contained exactly what I expected. Insurance forms, property documents, investment summaries from years ago. Then I found something odd. Tucked inside a folder marked estate planning was a handwritten note in Robert's familiar script. It was not a formal document, just a reminder he had written to himself. Across the top of the page were 4 simple words. Review retirement transfer details. Underneath was a phone number I did not recognize. My pulse quickened. I stared at the note for a long moment. Robert had always handled our long-term financial planning. If he had written this shortly before his death, it might explain Daniel's question at Thanksgiving. For the first time, I felt like I was standing near the edge of something important. Not proof, not answers, just the beginning of a trail. I carefully folded the note and placed it in my purse. Then I looked around the quiet office that Robert and I had shared for decades. Someone knew exactly what that note meant, and I was beginning to suspect that whoever knew the answer had never expected me to start asking questions. I waited until the next morning before calling the number written on Robert's note. I told myself not to expect much. It had been 4 years since his passing. Companies changed. Employees retired. Phone numbers disappeared. Still, I could not ignore the feeling that this small piece of paper mattered. The call connected after 3 rings. A woman answered with a professional greeting and the name of a financial advisory firm located in Des Moines. For a moment, I could not speak. Robert had worked with several advisors over the years, but I had never heard this firm's name before. I introduced myself and explained that I had found an old note among my husband's papers. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then the woman asked for my full name. I gave it to her. Another pause followed, longer this time. I heard typing in the background. Finally, her voice changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "Mrs. Collins, would you be available to come into our office this week?" My stomach tightened. "Is there a problem?" I asked. "I think it would be better to discuss certain records in person," she replied carefully. She offered me an appointment for Thursday morning. After ending the call, I sat quietly at the kitchen table. The conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it left me with more questions than answers. If there was nothing unusual, why invite me to the office? Why had the woman sounded surprised when she heard my name? Thursday could not come fast enough. During the next 2 days, I found myself noticing even more details from the past. It was as though my mind had finally been given permission to examine things it had ignored before. I remembered how often Vanessa volunteered to help organize paperwork after Robert died. At the time, I had been grateful. Grief made simple tasks feel overwhelming. She sorted files, collected documents, helped prepare records for accountants and attorneys. Everyone praised her generosity, including me. Yet now I wondered how much access she had actually been given. I wondered what she had seen, what she had handled, what she might have known. On Thursday morning, I left home before sunrise. The drive to Des Moines took a little over 2 hours. The interstate stretched ahead beneath a gray winter sky. During the trip, I kept rehearsing possible explanations. Perhaps the retirement account had been closed years ago. Perhaps Daniel misunderstood something Robert had told him. Perhaps there was a simple clerical mistake. By the time I arrived, I had convinced myself not to expect any shocking discoveries. The office occupied the 3rd floor of a modern brick building overlooking a small river. Inside, everything felt polished and quiet. A receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room. A few minutes later, a financial advisor entered carrying a thin folder. He introduced himself as Michael Reeves and shook my hand. Then he sat across from me and opened the folder. "Mrs. Collins," he began gently, "before we discuss the account, there is something I need to understand. Were you aware that your retirement transfer was completed almost 4 years ago?" The room seemed to go silent. I stared at him. "No," I said. "I was not aware of any transfer." Michael looked genuinely confused. He lowered his eyes to the documents in front of him. Then he slowly turned one page toward me. At the top was my name. Beneath it was a transaction date from 4 years earlier. And next to it was an amount so large that I forgot how to breathe for a moment. The number on the page was just over $700,000. I looked at it once. Then again. The figure did not change. For 4 years I had worried about every expense, while a sum large enough to transform my retirement had apparently existed somewhere beyond my reach. Michael remained quiet, allowing me time to process what I was seeing. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. "Where is it?" He frowned slightly and reviewed the documents. "According to these records, the funds were transferred into a managed retirement account established under your name shortly after your husband passed away." My hands tightened around the edge of the table. Then why have I never received statements? Why have I never withdrawn money? Why have I never even heard about this account? Michael looked uncomfortable. He turned several more pages. "That is where things become unusual." He slid another document across the table. Attached to the account was a mailing address I immediately recognized. It was not my home. It was Daniel and Vanessa's address. For a moment, I simply stared at it. My son and daughter-in-law had moved into that house 3 years before Robert died. Every statement, every notice, Every update connected to the account had apparently been sent there. How could this happen? I asked quietly. Michael studied the records again. The address change request was submitted during the transfer process. I felt my pulse quicken. Submitted by whom? He hesitated. I cannot answer that without a formal review. But I can tell you the request was accepted because supporting documentation was provided at the time. Supporting documentation. The phrase echoed in my mind. Someone had not merely made a mistake. Someone had taken deliberate steps. Michael continued explaining the account history. Annual reports had been generated. Tax summaries had been mailed. Multiple communications had been sent over the years. All of them went somewhere other than my home. As he spoke, pieces of the puzzle began fitting together. The missing envelopes. The casual reassurances. The strange confidence Vanessa displayed whenever financial matters came up. By the end of the meeting, Michael provided copies of several documents and promised to initiate a complete internal review. I thanked him and left the office carrying a folder that suddenly felt heavier than its actual weight. Outside, cold wind swept across the parking lot. I sat inside my car for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine. My reflection in the windshield looked older than it had a week earlier. Not weaker, just wiser. The drive home felt different from the drive there. Before, I had questions. Now I had evidence. Not enough to reach conclusions. Not enough to accuse anyone. But enough to know my instincts had been right. Something had been hidden from me. Late that evening, after returning home, I spread the documents across my dining room table. The same table where Daniel had asked that innocent question on Thanksgiving. I examined every page carefully. Dates, account numbers, signatures, addresses. Most of it was technical language. Then one detail caught my attention. Near the bottom of an early transfer document was the name of a witness. It was not Daniel. It was not Vanessa. It was someone else entirely. A woman named Linda Harper. The name sounded familiar. After several moments, I remembered why. Linda had been one of Robert's oldest friends. She had worked with him years earlier and attended every major family event I could remember. If anyone knew what happened during those final months before Robert died, it might be her. I picked up my phone and searched for her contact information. When her number appeared on the screen, I stared at it for a long moment before pressing call. Deep down, I had the feeling that the next conversation might change everything. Linda answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded older than I remembered, but still warm. When I introduced myself, she immediately recognized my name. We exchanged a few polite words before I mentioned Robert. The line grew quiet. I think about him often, she said softly. I told her I had recently discovered some documents connected to a retirement account. Then I mentioned seeing her name listed as a witness on one of the transfer records. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Careful. Measured. Margaret, she finally said, I have wondered for years whether you ever received what Robert intended for you. My grip tightened around the phone. What do you mean? I asked. Linda let out a slow breath. Your husband was very concerned during his final months. Not about his health. About making sure you would be financially secure after he was gone. I closed my eyes. This sounded exactly like Robert. He had always worried more about other people than himself. Linda explained that she attended several meetings with Robert and his financial advisors because she occasionally helped review business documents after her retirement. According to her, Robert had created a detailed plan designed to provide me with a comfortable income for the rest of my life. Nothing extravagant, just security, freedom from financial stress. The kind of retirement we had spent decades working toward together. He was proud of that plan, Linda said. He talked about it often. I looked across my living room at the photographs lining the mantel. Robert smiling beside a fishing boat. Robert holding Daniel as a little boy. Robert standing in front of the house we built together. Then why did none of it reach me? I asked quietly. I do not know, Linda admitted. But I remember one thing very clearly. She paused. Robert specifically told everyone that all communication regarding the account should go directly to you. My stomach sank. Directly to me. Yet every record I had seen pointed somewhere else. Linda continued. During one meeting shortly before Robert passed away, she remembered Vanessa attending briefly to help with paperwork because Daniel was traveling for work. At the time, nothing about it seemed unusual. Family members often assisted during difficult periods. But now, hearing everything I had discovered, she sounded troubled. Margaret, I cannot accuse anyone of anything, she said carefully. But what you are describing does not match what Robert wanted. After we ended the call, I sat alone for a long time. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. Outside, the bare branches of the oak tree moved gently in the wind. Inside, another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Robert had planned for me. The account existed. The money existed. The instructions existed. Somewhere between his intentions and my reality, something had gone terribly wrong. Later that evening, I reviewed the documents again. This time I noticed another detail I had overlooked. Several account updates showed electronic access requests submitted over the years. The account had not been forgotten. Someone had been monitoring it. Someone had been actively managing information connected to it. As I studied the dates, a pattern emerged. Many of the requests occurred during periods when Vanessa frequently visited my home to help organize paperwork or collect mail while I traveled. For the first time, a possibility formed in my mind that I could no longer ignore. Perhaps this was never a misunderstanding. Perhaps someone had been making sure I remained unaware. And if that was true, then the answers I needed were much closer to home than I had ever imagined. The next step was the hardest one because it involved someone I loved. Until that point, I had focused mostly on documents, dates, and records. Paper could not lie. Paper did not become defensive. Paper did not look hurt when difficult questions were asked. People were different, especially family. For several days, I avoided calling Daniel. Not because I was afraid of him, because I was afraid of what I might learn. Every new piece of information seemed to point in the same direction, yet something about the situation continued to bother me. If Daniel had known about the retirement account all along, why did he ask about it so casually at Thanksgiving? The question made no sense. If he had been hiding something, he would never have brought it up himself. The more I thought about it, the less his behavior matched someone protecting a secret. One afternoon, I decided to review every document again from the beginning. This time, instead of focusing on money, I focused on timing. I made a timeline across several sheets of paper. Robert's final meetings, the account transfer, address changes, electronic access requests, mail notifications. As the timeline grew, another pattern appeared. Nearly every unusual activity occurred during periods when Daniel was traveling for work. Some trips lasted only a few days. Others stretched into weeks. During those same periods, Vanessa often handled household matters for both of them. She paid bills, organized records, scheduled appointments, managed details. It was something everyone praised her for, including Daniel. The realization settled slowly. Then all at once, Daniel may have trusted Vanessa completely, perhaps too completely. That evening, I called him. My heart was steady when he answered. We spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather, his work, a local football game. Then I casually asked whether he remembered much about the retirement account his father established. Not really, he admitted. Dad explained some of it years ago, but Vanessa handled most of the paperwork after he got sick. I remained silent. Daniel continued speaking without realizing how important every word had become. Honestly, Mom, I never paid close attention. Vanessa is better with documents than I am. There it was. Not an admission, not evidence, but something that fit perfectly with everything else I had discovered. Before ending the call, I asked another question. Did you ever receive statements or reports about the account? No, he replied immediately. I assumed they were mailed directly to you. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my living room. The answer had come easier than I expected. Daniel sounded confused, not cautious. Concerned, not defensive. For the first time since this began, I felt a small measure of relief. The possibility that my son knowingly watched me struggle for years had weighed heavily on my heart. Now that burden felt lighter. Not gone, just lighter. Later that night, I received an email from Michael at the financial firm. The internal review had uncovered additional account activity. Several authorization requests had been submitted electronically over the years. Attached to the message was a list of access records and device information. I studied the report carefully. Most of it was technical language I barely understood. Then I noticed something familiar. One of the listed devices matched an old laptop Vanessa used during family gatherings. I remembered it because she carried it everywhere. My eyes remained fixed on the screen. The picture was finally becoming clear. Someone had been managing access. Someone had been receiving information. Someone had been making decisions while I remained completely unaware. And with every passing day, the circle of possibilities grew smaller. By the end of that week, I knew enough to stop collecting clues and start revealing them. I called Daniel on Friday afternoon and invited him and Vanessa to dinner the following Sunday. I kept my voice light, warm, familiar. Just family, I said. Nothing special. Daniel happily accepted. Vanessa sounded relaxed when she greeted me. Neither of them knew that Michael from the financial advisory firm had agreed to join us later that evening. Neither of them knew that Linda Harper had recently shared details about Robert's final wishes. Most importantly, neither of them knew about the sealed letter I had received 2 days earlier. A letter Robert had written shortly before his death. One I had never seen before. Sunday arrived cold and bright. I spent the morning preparing dinner. Pot roast, roasted vegetables, fresh rolls, the same meals that had brought my family together for decades. By late afternoon, the dining room looked exactly as it always had. Candles flickered softly. Family photographs lined the shelves. The oak table gleamed beneath the warm lights overhead. At 5 o'clock sharp, Daniel and Vanessa arrived. Daniel hugged me. Vanessa brought a pie from a local bakery. She smiled easily, confidently. During dinner, the conversation remained pleasant. We discussed work, travel plans, and local news. More than once, I found myself studying their faces and wondering how differently this evening would end compared to how it began. After dessert, I cleared several plates and returned carrying a small folder. Daniel noticed it immediately. "Mom, what is that?" he asked. I sat down calmly. "Something your father wanted us to discuss someday." Both of them looked surprised. I began slowly. I explained the retirement account, the missing statements, the address connected to their home, the access records, Linda's recollections. With each new detail, Daniel's expression grew more confused. Vanessa became noticeably quieter. Then I placed several documents on the table. Nobody spoke. The room seemed unusually still. "There has to be some explanation," Daniel said. His voice sounded uncertain now. "I agree," I replied. "That is why I asked someone to join us." A few moments later, the doorbell rang. Daniel looked startled. Vanessa's eyes immediately shifted toward the hallway. I stood and opened the door. Michael entered carrying a leather portfolio. After introductions, he sat beside me and calmly explained the results of the firm's review. The account had been active. Communications had been redirected. Access requests had been submitted over several years. Every statement matched the records already sitting on the table. Daniel listened in stunned silence. Then Michael removed one final item from his portfolio. A sealed envelope. "Mrs. Collins asked me to bring this," he said. My heart tightened as I recognized Robert's handwriting. Michael explained that the letter had been stored with estate planning records and released only after questions arose regarding the account. With trembling hands, I opened it. The room was silent as I began reading aloud. Robert's words were simple. He wrote about love, about family, about wanting me to live comfortably after he was gone. Then came a sentence that changed everything. "Margaret, if you are reading this, something may have prevented my plans from reaching you. Trust the documents. Trust the truth. And never allow anyone, including family, to convince you that you deserve less than what we built together." Tears filled Daniel's eyes. Vanessa lowered her head. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The letter rested quietly in my hands. At that moment, it was no longer about money. It was about trust, about choices, about the difference between protecting someone and taking control away from them. And as I looked around the table, I realized that for the first time since Robert's passing, every secret was finally sitting in plain sight. For several moments after I finished reading Robert's letter, nobody spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual. The candles on the table continued to flicker softly. Everything looked normal, yet nothing felt the same. Daniel stared at the letter as though he were seeing his father again for the first time in years. Then he looked at the documents spread across the table. Finally, he turned toward Vanessa. "Did you know?" he asked quietly. Not angrily, not accusingly, just asking for the truth. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. She looked exhausted, older somehow. After a long silence, she nodded. Slowly, she admitted that when Robert became ill, she had become heavily involved in organizing paperwork. At first, she claimed she was simply trying to help. Then opportunities appeared. Decisions became easier to make without questions. Statements arrived at her home. Notifications came directly to her devices. Over time, she convinced herself she was managing things more effectively than anyone else could. She never took ownership of the money itself, but she controlled access to information. She controlled what people knew. Most importantly, she controlled what I did not know. I kept telling myself I would explain everything later, she said quietly. Then later never came. Daniel looked devastated. Not because of the account, because trust had been broken. The room fell silent again. I could see him replaying years of conversations in his mind. Years of assumptions. Years of believing everything was being handled properly. In that moment, I finally understood something that had taken me weeks to learn. This story was never really about money. Money was simply the trail that revealed a much deeper problem. The real issue was control. Someone had decided what information I deserved to have. Someone had quietly placed themselves between me and the life Robert intended for me. The following weeks brought consequences that did not require shouting or revenge. The financial firm completed its review. All account communications were redirected to my home. New security measures were established. Every remaining question was documented and addressed. For the first time since Robert's passing, I had direct access to everything that belonged to me. Daniel also made changes. Difficult ones. Necessary ones. He became actively involved in reviewing family finances and legal records instead of assuming someone else was handling them. More importantly, he began rebuilding something far more valuable than any retirement account. Accountability. As for me, I made a decision of my own. A month later, I used part of the retirement funds exactly as Robert had hoped I would. Not on anything extravagant. Not on luxury. I replaced my aging car with a reliable new one. I repaired several things around the house that I had postponed for years. I booked a river cruise I had once declined because I thought I could not afford it. Small choices. Ordinary choices. Yet each one felt like reclaiming a piece of the future Robert had worked so hard to protect. One spring morning, several months later, I sat beneath the oak tree he planted when Daniel was 10 years old. Sunlight filtered through the branches above me. Birds moved across the bright blue sky. In my lap rested Robert's letter, now worn from being read so many times. I smiled as I looked across the yard we had built together. I had spent years believing that giving everything to family meant trusting without question. Now I understood the difference. Love requires trust. Wisdom requires attention. The two are not the same. Robert's final gift was not the money he left behind. It was the truth hidden inside that letter. A truth that reminded me who I was, what we had built together, and why no one should ever surrender their voice simply because they trust the people they love. And for the first time in many years, I felt something stronger than disappointment, stronger than regret, and even stronger than relief. I felt free.